Okay. Well, my name is Candy Evans, and I'm probably going to be someone different in this documentary. I know a lot of the people in this documentary are people who have been um, fans of Jim and have been very influenced by him. Um, I actually knew Jim when I lived in Huntington Beach, California in 1968. And so I knew Jim for the duration of the time I lived in California. And so I will be speaking about Jim as a friend, as somebody who actually knew him. And that is my whole reason for being in this documentary. Um, I, I want to have people know him the way I knew him, or at least I'm just trying to reveal some things about him that maybe not everybody might know about him. So I was 20 years old. I lived in California, and I have been, he changed my whole life. Even to this day, I think about Jim and my time with him, his influence, the things he said, uh, which has really given my life more of a direction and a focus. So, 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 I know one of the questions is, what would you like to have talked about if you'd met Jim in person? And some of the things, of course, we talked about were art and poetry and history. He really enjoyed talking about what the next world would be like. That was always very interesting to me because I had lost somebody in my family and when I was quite young, and it was something I thought a lot about, was the next world and what happens after we die. We like to talk about different things. One of the things that he did talk about that stands out in my memory is the possibility that we evolved out of the ocean, because I really hadn't thought about that or heard that coming out of Texas, very conservative Texas, and that was something that I thought was a really interesting concept. I know another one of the questions was about Jim's interest in literature and how he started to write. He told me he always loved reading stories as a child and reading poems, and so because of his love of reading, he was a really good reader. Apparently as a child, that encouraged him to start writing when he was young. Okay. And what would I say about Pamela? And anyway, my feeling is perhaps at the beginning of the relationship there was love, of course, but over time I know she created a lot of stress for Jim, and much of what had happened between them created more problems for Jim later on. She became very dependent on drugs and brought strange people into their relationship. And Jim did not like this. A lot of these people were low-life characters. It drained him and took, she was spending quite a bit of money that way. I don't think it was the money. I think it was because of the people that were coming around. And these people were around Pam, of course, because they had drugs, and so that was how they came together, and Jim didn't care for that. So it became a huge strain on him, the relationship over time.
Have you met Pam?
No, I did not meet Pam. So I know in one of the questions was about possessions, and I believe the reason he didn't care for possessions is because he just liked simplicity. He felt like having a lot of stuff around, having things, was a distraction. He liked to be alone. He liked to be quiet when he was working. And I think too much stuff around him was just, like I was saying, just kind of distracted him. He didn't like the feeling of something owning him.
Is that true that he lived in a roof?
Yes, when he got out of college, and that's one of the questions.
Oh, okay.
That is one of the questions on there. But that was just for like a summer that he was up there. But, still, it gets cold at night. Have you been to Los Angeles?
Yes.
Okay, even in the summer it gets cold at night.
Yeah, sometimes it is.
Yeah, so, but he was just up there right after he graduated. He loved being outside, and he loved nature, and he loved looking at the sky and being under that sky. He felt like that was stimulated him for what he liked to write. And, when he was up there on that roof, he had many things come to him, and he could almost, he was like writing even songs in his head when he was on top of that roof. That was an inspirational time for him. So we were talking about things, and he didn't care for things. He didn't care for possessions because, like I said, they were just a distraction from him. And he didn't like the idea of feeling like something that he had to keep attending to things around him. He would rather be out in nature and be inspired. One of the things that was brought up is how important freedom was to Jim. And I think in every possible way, what I feel like it did for me is that knowing Jim taught me how to think out of the box. And I liked sitting down and writing, and he encouraged me to just write and not worry about how I was writing or exactly what I was writing. And I have continued to do that throughout my life because of he was a huge influence on me. He taught me how to view life in a more bemused way and not to take things so seriously. His words have really stayed with me over time. He was just that dynamic and that charismatic. So we were talking about when Jim lived on the rooftop, and that was right after he graduated from college, and he felt very inspired by being up on that roof. That was an easy and free time for him. When he was on stage, it certainly brought out the theatrical part of him.
He loved theater and this kind of...
Yes, he loved theater, and he felt like in some way we're all in a theater, and he was on stage where he could just kind of act out some of more of the theater of life. I saw the Doors for the very first time in September of 1967 in Fort Worth, Texas. And it was great because there were probably no more than 300 people there. And it was it was in a complex, an area where people could just get up and walk around or sit down. And so it was it was great. I have a picture of him wrapped around a pole, and I can show you that. We could put that in here perhaps later on. But so that's where I first saw Jim perform.
Did he know you before the
No, and
for
he
this concert and for
no, and he hadn't really met my brother yet, so I didn't know him yet. So if I had, I would have gone over to him, but he was just standing there by the stage. Anybody could walk over to him and talk to him. And so all the Doors were just standing around.
So he was a nice person. No? You could say or speak with him.
Oh,
easily.
he was very available. Yeah, very easy to go up to. He was wearing black leather. He was wearing black leather, and he kind of had this ominous look. And I remember it was the day before Labor Day. It was a Sunday, and the next day was going to be Labor Day. And we're in Texas, and it was well over 100 degrees outside. And when he came in and I saw him in that black leather, I thought he had to be dying coming out of that Texas heat. And he was cool as a cucumber. He was just cool as a cucumber. He didn't look like he was sweating. I just didn't know how he pulled that off. And he was rather ominous looking, to us here in Texas, not being in Los Angeles or New York. We were more small town. He did not look approachable, but truly, he was an approachable person, and just standing there, anybody could go over and talk to him. In fact, there was a young girl, she looked like she was about 10 years old, that went over and talked to him. There were a lot of families in the audience, which was interesting. Mothers and fathers and their children had come to see the Doors. I don't know what they thought they were coming to see. And this little girl, probably about 10 years old, walked over and talked to him, and you could just see how much he enjoyed talking with this little girl. So right there, I remember thinking, oh, he's probably a nice guy to approach. He likes children, that's for sure.
Is there someone like him today who like to, how can I say, try to imitate him?
Oh, a lot of groups have tried to imitate him, even the way they stand at the microphone and sing. You can see he's had a huge influence that way. I know that there are people like Robert Plant was influenced by Jim, and I believe the lead singer of Aerosmith was influenced by Jim, and just numerous ones. I really don't know who's out there today, but his legacy continues on. Someone like him will always be, will influence singers and artists and musicians in many different ways.
Can you say that again?
When Jim's holding the microphone, he was making love to it. You can see the way he's looking at it, and his expression of what he's doing with the song. It's like the microphone was another person, and you see this thing going on back and forth, that was very unique, very original. Elvis did that. Elvis for sure did that, and maybe even Frank Sinatra, but I don't think anyone from my generation in music had been that kind of dynamic with a microphone. But you can definitely see it today.
Second place.
Okay. So what was really interesting is meeting Jim is that we had quite a few things in common. And we're both Celts on both sides of our family. He's Scottish. Morrison was Scottish, and his mother's name was Clark. And I know there was Irish Scottish there in her name. And my last name is Evans, and my mother's last name is Bailey. So I'm Celtic on both sides of my family. Yes. And both of us had Southern fathers. He in fact has relatives that live in Texas, which I thought was interesting. And I have learned since that his sister and brother have come to Texas to have family reunions. So there was even a kind of a Texas connection there. When I was born in Palo Alto and Los Altos. He was living in Los Altos, which was just a few miles from where I was born. Also, he loves the Southwest. I grew up in the Southwest. He really considered the South and the Southwest more of his own home, where he felt more of a connection. He loves the Southwest. When he lived in Virginia, I lived in Baltimore, Maryland, so we did not live that far from each other. I grew up with my brother in a rock and roll band who was the lead singer, and so I also had that connection with him through music. And I grew up listening to my brother loved blues. I listened to blues with my brother, my older brother, and my mother loved classical music and opera. And I could bring up these genres of music to Jim, and he knew the classical pieces, the classical pianists, even opera that my mother played listening, that I was growing up when I was listening to that. I remember so well the pieces, the names, and he knew every one of them. So it was really interesting to meet somebody who's in, quote, I called it a rock and roll band, and had this knowledge of classical music. I was very surprised. So, but there were things about him that were just, I was always learning, and always had these great surprises coming of many things that he knew.
You have your notes.
I do. I think I really, we both came out of Presbyterian families, and my father was with the federal government, and we moved around constantly, and Jim moved around also. I think that creates within yourself, having to move and be in a new place. You've got to learn how to meet people and talk to people, and I think that for him that really came in handy when he would do interviews and meet people. He could be very quiet. When I was with him, I really enjoyed being with him because he was more quiet like I was, and I didn't feel like I needed to just be talking when I'm with him. He really enjoyed long periods of quietness, and I did too. My notes, well, there's some of this that, I love writing, and he encouraged me to write. And when I met him, I didn't know too much, but one of my favorite poets was William Blake, and then I found out that his was also William Blake. We both love getting in our cars and driving out to the desert. Coming out of Texas, I love the mountains and the desert, and so did Jim. But he also loved the mountains. He also loved the ocean, and he loved just getting in the car and getting out of town. We also had that in common. When I met him, I was wearing I had black boots, black cowboy boots, that I had ridden my horse in many of the performing play days that I was in. And I had on my black boots, and he had on his black boots when I met him. And that became a conversational piece right there, because I said, "Oh, you're wearing black cowboy boots." He said, "Yeah, I love these boots." And so that right there, we also had that in common. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of bring up the movie, the Doors movie. And the reason I want to bring that up is because Jim really was not portrayed as the person I knew him. Nowhere throughout that film do you see his sense of humor. He is probably one of the funniest people I've ever met, even to this day. I don't think I've ever met anyone as quick in their mind as the ability to look at anything, at events, at stories, at people, things people say, with his ability to bring out the humor and to call it in such a way. He was so perceptive, but it was always through humor. He could be rather sarcastic, but it was just part of his humor, and some of the sarcasm was really there to just kind of strip something and show it for what it really was. So what you never see Jim's humor, and for anyone to have known Jim, you're gonna see his humor. I mean, Jim and humor are synonymous, and that's not at all portrayed in that film. And maybe people don't know how really funny he was. I think it's rare to meet somebody who has that type of humor, and of course that goes along with how intelligent he was. That he could show you something and let it seem humorous, and not necessarily being unkind. He was just showing a side of something through humor. Okay, so one of the questions was Jim obsessed with death, and I would say there's a reason he was, and I truly do believe he was obsessed with death. He told me he had a vision of himself, and it had to do with water, and it had to do with his own death. Okay, yes, and I would just like to read something that I wrote about Jim, and this is what I felt. I wrote this. I just said, in many fairy tales, there is a peculiar and enchanting figure, sometimes called an Undine, sometimes called a mermaid, who lives in the depths of the sea or even a vast lake and falls in love with a mortal man. This legend can also be seen, for instance, like in the Swan Prince. Although the creature from the other realm bears feathers rather than scales, all of these ancient tales in their various forms have the same basic theme: the union with a mortal, a flesh and blood human, with something from another level of reality. Jim stood on the shore of the Pacific and saw her flash her tail above the water, catching the sunlight for a brief moment on her scales. He heard the calling in her song and forgot he had human lungs, and made the plunge. This was a marriage of destiny. I said Jim was no slouch. He entered the garden, granted to the gods, and continued on his quest. He had now been granted the vision he so longed for from the pearl given by the Hydra of Lerna, an entrance into the underworld. I just truly believe that, he had this vision. Something was calling him. And I think that was part of the obsession with death, that he just was tuned into this other realm, and like the siren's song, it just kept calling him. But his obsession with death was not morbid. It wasn't like that. I know he's got this reputation for being, they talk about self-destruction, but he was not self-destructive. He was not. There were things around him that stressed him, and probably that he turned to alcohol, but he was not a morbid, down, depressed type of person. What do I believe? Let me tell you what I believe happened. I believe Pam was involved with this, either directly or indirectly. I'm not sure. This is my own personal feeling. Possibly that, I know Jim had been having some problems breathing with his, there was something going on with his lungs at the time, and with Pam living with him and having her drugs around, I think something happened. Maybe he ingested one of her drugs and possibly did have a heart attack. And I believe that she probably called this man she was seeing, this count who was supplying her with her drugs, and came over, and maybe Jim had passed out or had a heart attack or whatever, and they put him in the bathtub, and that's where he died, in that bathtub. That's my own personal opinion. That's what I think happened. I think if he had not had Pam around with her drugs, I don't think Jim would have died. I think she was a terrible influence. She had people around her that were into drugs, hardcore drugs, low-life people, and that's never a good scenario. You can't have a positive outcome with that. And Jim never liked that. He did not like those people care for him, but they were her friends, and so they came around. Bad scene, just a bad scene. That when Pam flew back to America after they'd buried Jim, that she told people she felt guilty for Jim's death. She told more than she told at least 3 people that. Well, I know he liked the European films that have so much abstract symbolism in them. They're really over my head. But that possibly is probably, or could have been the direction Jim went in to make films.
Have you seen any film that he made?
I have not. Oh no, that's not true. He made a film called Highway.
He wasn't.
In California, right? And you can watch that on the internet. Uh, Again, it's pretty symbolic. So,
But it's just imagination, just
no,
fantasy, no?
no, it really happened. And he really could sense that some of those Indians, that their soul had left their body, and he could sense that happening. That they were not only that they were in the process of dying and died, and their souls. I mean, this is a very perceptive little boy. He knew something, even though nobody talked to him about it. Nobody explained it to him. I mean, how can you? But it was something that stayed with him the rest of his life. And there's also about death and seeing death as a little boy. That was quite a thing. Well, seems, I have met people on the internet. I've met people, not really in person, who say that Jim has come and visited them in his spirit. And I think it's really interesting to hear this. There are people I know who have channeled Jim and given messages from the other side. And I find it's all very interesting. He, I just have to say it, Jim did come and visit me on August the 8th, 1998. It was a Saturday, and I was in my bedroom, sitting on my bed. It was close to 7 p.m., and I was sitting there, and to my right, I felt Jim standing just to my right, and it, I, it was it was such a surprise. It was almost shocking because I'd never felt his presence before, not like that. Maybe something here and there, or a thought I had could have been a thought from him or something he would say, kind of like that in the past. But this was Jim. This was his soul. And I felt him standing here to my right, and I just froze. I was sitting on my bed, and I was just sitting there, and I hate to say it, but I was just kind of freaked out. So I just got off my bed and walked out of my bedroom and came into the den, and I just had to stand there. I was just so taken with how strongly I was feeling his presence. I became really overwhelmed, to say the least. And I had to stand in the den and just collect myself, because his presence, there was no mistaking his presence, that it was Jim. It just felt like Jim had walked into the room and just came over and stood right next to me on my right side. So I had to just take some breaths and realize that he had finally come to see me and say hello. I had always hoped he would come by, but it had been 27 years since he died. In fact, I figured out it had been 27 years and a month and like 3 days since he had died, and I thought, did you have to wait 27 years before you were going to make your presence known to me? But anyway, I guess, he showed up. He just did it when he could do it and when the conditions were right and when I could feel it. I remember we were having a particularly hot summer that summer, and that was August. And like 40 days in a row, we'd had over 100-degree weather. And I remember thinking how hot it was and how unusually hot, and we were in this drought. And so, I don't know, maybe those conditions somehow let Jim come through to me.
Did he say something?
Well, I got up and I left the room. And so I probably didn't let him have time to say anything because it was just a shock to me. And I came back in my bedroom and just sat there and was just really trying to absorb the experience I was having. But he did come back. After that time, he did come back other times. And I wasn't just in my bedroom. I was in my car one time and I felt his presence. And I was taking a walk down the street and I felt his presence. Another time, I was in a food store another time when I felt his presence. So it was just random. But after that initial time of August the 8th, 1998, after that, I started feeling his presence at various times. And I felt like he was in a good place. I felt like he had a lot more understanding of his life and some of his own behavior and actions, which I know at times he was perplexed about. In fact, I really don't even know how he got through his own life. There was so much going on in his life, and he was under a tremendous amount of stress and strain for being that young. Anyway, I just would always get this feeling that a very positive energy, a very positive feeling from him, and that he was doing well, that he had a lot more understanding of his life, which was, I was real happy for him. And I felt his presence not too long ago. So I think it's interesting that other people are also feeling his presence. I mean, in Europe, there's people in Europe who've had this experience around the world. So it's very interesting. How he gets around like that, I don't know. But anyway. And I just found her last year, and she was reading from the 27 Club, all these people that had died. She was reading she's a psychic, and she was reading like Brian Jones. She was reading Janis Joplin. They were reading Jimi Hendrix, and she was reading Jim, and she was just describing Jim as I knew him to a T, and I thought, wow, that's really amazing. I ended up getting in touch with her, and she did a reading for me and really confirmed about Jim coming around me and where he was at, and that she said he was in a very good space and was growing and had a lot more ability to look back on his life and understand things. So.
Okay.
So I've had many dreams of Jim over the years. I see him with horses, and I see him riding horses. Horses are often accompanying him in the dreams I've had about him. I also see him somewhere way out in the country, and one of the things he used to love to do is lie on his back and look at the stars at night. And I've had many dreams about him where he's still looking at the stars on a starry night, especially when it's a darker night and you can see the stars. He loved doing that. He really liked contemplating the stars and how many galaxies are out there, and so still have dreams like that about him. What?
What do you think about it?
About Jim staging his death? No way. I think Jim would have gotten in touch with me, and I have felt Jim's soul come to me. There is no way Jim staged his death. Jim really died. I just don't think people want him to leave. They want to keep him alive and are hopeful that he is still. It'd be wonderful if maybe he did just not want to be famous anymore and be in the limelight, and that he did stage his death and he's living on an island somewhere. I'd be real happy for him if that were true, and I wish it were. But he died. Unfortunately, he did die. The only place that Jim has lived that I've visited is the Alta Cienega Motel. Went back there in 2002 when there was a Doors Fest. It was part of a tour, and I went with the tour and went in there, and his room is so full of graffiti. I did not feel Jim's presence in there. I don't think Jim would even want to be in that motel room, but it's a tribute to him, and it's how fans can come and write something about him. So that's the only place I have been to that Jim lived in. It's amazing that he died so many years ago, and he's probably even more known today, or more popular than even when he was with the Doors, and probably many things for that. One thing is the movie let a lot of younger generations know who the Doors were. But he seems to appeal to people in many different ways. I think he was really the James Dean of music at that time. He brought a new energy. The Doors did. They brought a new energy in altogether. He died young. He died full of life and potential. And that's always something I think that will appeal to people, that this person that had so much to live for, and at 27 they're gone. He also, I think, created a great persona of mystery. He loved mystery. He loved a good story. He loved anything that had to do with mystery. And so it looks like he created his own mystery he's still a mystery to people. People are still very intrigued by him. There's just something so profound about him, and he was just a very soulful person. And his poetry, his writing, there are people who have found so much in that and have helped them in their life. There's a woman that I have met who lives in Scotland, and her life entirely changed because of Jim in the most positive way. She went to college, and she has read all these books that she never would have read. She's much more educated and more literate. She says Jim just gave her a direction that she had not had before. And I think that's what he's doing for a lot of people. Okay, so there's some things written about Jim where he's considered a shaman. And that's not just a word put on him. That is something I have personally experienced watching Jim. I went up with Jim to Lake Arrowhead, and it's this beautiful lake that's, that we went up to in Southern California. And we went up there and sat right by the lake, and there was a flock of ducks that were flying on the other side of the lake. And he said, we were sitting there, and he said, I'm going to get those ducks to fly over to us and fly overhead and go fly over our head and go back out to the lake where they are right now, where they're coming from. And I just sat there going, you are? You're going to do you're going to do that? Anyway, and we sat there, and he just watched that flock at the other end of the lake. He just sat there quietly and concentrated on these ducks. And I'd say, I don't know, a few minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes later, that flock of ducks that were flying had turned around and were flying straight toward us and came right over us and turned around and went back down at the edge of the lake, just like he said they were going to do. That really happened. I don't know how many people saw that side to him, but this word shaman, which is associated with Jim, he really had an ability, because I witnessed it. I also saw him do that when we were down at the beach in Huntington Beach, right there on the sand. I saw him do that with some seagulls that were really far out in the ocean. And he said, I can bring those seagulls up here to the beach. And he concentrated on those seagulls. This was after Lake Arrowhead. This was later on that we sat at the beach, and he concentrated on those seagulls, and they flew right over to us. These are true stories. So that's what I'm hoping, is that I can tell something about Jim that maybe people don't know. And if you ever saw him in concert, and the way he came across and the way people responded to him, and the Doors, I should just say the Doors, they're such a great band, but the way what Jim could do with the people that are sitting out in his concerts was really magical. I think he could get them to really respond in a way that I'd been to other concerts and not witnessed that before. So that's okay. Okay, yes, all right. I wanted to read a poem that Jim wrote, and the reason I want to read this is because he can do. I saw him do things that are like in this poem, and the name of the poem is called Power. And so he says, I can make the earth stop in its tracks. I made the blue cars go away. I can make myself invisible or small. I can become gigantic and reach the farthest things. I can change the course of nature. I can place myself anywhere in space or time. I can summon the dead. I can perceive events on other worlds, in my deepest inner mind and in the minds of others. I am. Okay, so here's a poem by Jim, and I wanted to read this. The name of it is called Power. So this is his poem. says, I can make the earth stop in its tracks. I made the blue cars go away. I can make myself invisible or small. I can become gigantic and reach the farthest things. I can change the course of nature. I can place myself anywhere in space or time. I can summon the dead. I can perceive events on other worlds in my deepest inner mind and in the minds of others. I can, I am. I personally got to see this, got to see him do this. I also, just one more thing I had thought of, when we were driving up to Oregon, there was a rainstorm that summer. We were driving up there and had to pull over. I actually kind of enjoyed the rainstorm, but he kind of wanted to get it out of the way so we could travel on, and I saw him sit there and concentrate on that rainstorm, and maybe it was coincidental, but the rain stopped. The rain stopped, and we continued on. We were enjoying this rainstorm, but then it just kept coming and coming and coming, and so there he goes. I watched him just close his eyes and concentrate like he did before with the seagulls and the ducks, and the rain in probably a minute or two did stop. You know what this is what I love about Jim, is that it's so funny because, you know, he was a kind of a chubby kid growing up. He wasn't a thin kid. He just had some weight on him. And because of that, I don't know, I just felt like he felt excluded in some ways, and it could have possibly added more to him being alone and he was introverted by nature anyway, but could have just added more to his own introversion, which possibly would lend itself to him reading and starting to write, so that could have been really a positive thing, that it had a positive outcome. And I know growing up he moved so much, so he was not considered excuse me, a popular kid, but then I moved all the time, and I know how that goes. There goes my voice. So I think growing up like that and moving around so much just added greatly to him. He was so multidimensional. And I think for being so young, he just had such an expanded way of looking at life. So who was he? Who was really Jim? He was just a nice, down-to-earth guy that happened to be very creative and very talented, and was at the right place at the right time to be with Ray and know Ray and have the band come together. He was very available. He was somebody you could go over to and talk to easily. He was not somebody that you would feel like you couldn't do that. You know, my memory is he was just a nice guy that influenced my life greatly. Even now, even the rest of my life, I was influenced greatly by him. Just a nice, down-to-earth guy who was fun. He was fun, really a fun person to be around. I forgot to add that.
Okay. So did you fall in love with him? Or Jim?
Oh, yes.
So tell
Oh,
me about it.
yes. Yeah. Don't put this on the film. But it's, you know what? I don't care if it is on the film, but I have told a little bit of my story on the internet, and there are women who have beat me up for doing this. Because he only loved Pam, he couldn't love you. You know that thing? But that's not true. So I would say yes, because I was so young, and I'd never met in my life anyone like Jim. It was a little bit over my head for me because I was just a young college girl and I was not sophisticated coming out of Texas, so what did I really know? And Jim was very charming, very articulate, and so funny. He was so funny. If nothing else, you just fall in love with him because I think all girls love a funny guy. You know, I think that's so appealing, and so he was very charismatic, just very charming. So sure, I let my heart go out to him. You bet. You bet. And I'd like to think that what I gave Jim in return, and why Jim did enjoy my company, is that I didn't want anything from Jim. I was just a college girl. He could just be himself with me. I met him under different circumstances and just being a fan. And so I think he could just relax and be himself. I think he I was just so different coming from Texas. I think there was a lot of amusement on his part to see the way what I came out of Texas and then to come to California. There was so much of what was going on out there. I didn't know anything about drugs, and I was not part of anything like that, and I had so much innocence. I think that he really enjoyed being with somebody who was not part of anything like that. And we both loved to go out into nature. He loved that, and so did I.
So you miss him.
Sure. Oh, sure. I never got over his death. And anyone that knew him personally would how could you ever just shouldn't have been. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. And I hopefully wish, what I'd like to think about, what I have wished for in my own mind, is that I gave him some kind of reprieve from that life that he was in, that I kind of gave him a break to be with me. And he still comes to visit me, so he's not completely out of my life.
Okay, nice.
Send a message to Jim. What would I say to Jim as a message? Don't hang out. Don't hang out with people who do drugs.
Say it again.
If I could talk to Jim, I'd say, don't you hang out with people who do drugs. And I'd do that to him and say, shame on you. It killed you. And I'd say the world misses you very much. The 27 Club, we lost all of them. We miss all of them so much. And I want him to just keep on being the good guy that he was. And he's pretty busy going to visit people everywhere. You know, I hope he's, he was a natural teacher. He just had a natural ability to teach people. And it seems like he was always teaching something. So all these people his spirit is going around and talking to, I hope he's teaching them something. That would be in his nature.